Yeah, look, the improvements on the Snowy is a very long-term project because it's a big river with a big catchment and had a lot of impacts. So what we're seeing is good progress towards an outcome, right, for the estuary. But what we don't know is whether there's any immediate benefit to the fish yet. So theoretically there's going to be, but evidence-wise, we don't know. For instance, we don't know exactly what it takes to get a bass to breed, right? So we know the theory of it, you know, late spring flows, you know, bass says, oh, here I go, I'll go down to Marlow and I'll join up with all the others and I'll spawn. But we haven't really seen a lot of evidence that they're doing it. So an example with the bass is we worked in with the Fisheries Authority and said in the short term, until we can work this out, let's stock some bass into the Snowy River. So we went and caught brood stock with a lot of people involved, and we went and spawned the bass out. We had a go here in Lakes Entrance, then we picked up with a guy in Narooma who does a good job, and we bred out some Snowy River bass, and then we put the fingerlings back in the river. So an environmental outcome, I suppose my message is not immediate, and that's where the partnerships are really critical. So if Fisheries had said, we're not interested in stock and bass, you know, good luck to you, we might not have got the outcome we've got so far. So I think I'm trying to explain that some things you do naturally, then other times you need some interventions, but you'll never get it all working together unless everybody's in partnership with one aim, and that's what's happening on the Snowy, and I think you'll see the fishing will get better and better.
I don't know anyone making a living, but that's all I've heard is why the fishing in the actual lakes, not tide or no affiliated lakes, is deteriorating at a very quick rate. Is there any management plan for the natives?
Yeah, I'm going to take that one on behalf of Kate because it's a good question, and I was pretty confident it was going to come up today because we've been getting a fair bit of correspondence in relation to netting in the Gippsland Lakes, and there's a campaign going now about the netting. You know, our position on that is that that fishery's been there a long time, and there are a lot of impacts that are occurring on the Gippsland Lakes at the moment. And you know, again, as Gus has pointed out, we're trying to work across all the agencies to improve that system as much as we can, whether it's land care practices and others. We're going to continue to monitor the commercial fishing that's occurring in Gippsland Lakes. And you know, we've got the data on the catches over the years, and we'll keep an eye on that data. But I will say there is probably a social question as well as a fisheries question in relation to that, and you know, and that will play out, I think. Yeah.
And once the buyout of all the professional fishermen up there, the Murray cod fishery is just exploded.
Yeah.
You know, I don't know enough about this fishery, but you know, the 12 months I've been here, that's all you see on Facebook or anywhere is people having a gripe about the commercial nets.
Yeah.
As I said, I don't care. You know, people have the right to earn a living.
Yeah.
But you know, you see all the figures and everything.
I think you made a good point. I mean, we're at a recreational fishing forum on Duskies today, and a lot of people would argue, well, without the commercials, there'll be more for the recs. If this was a commercial fishing forum talking about the netting in the bay, in the lakes, people may have a different position. I mean, we will come at it from a sustainability and management point of view, but ultimately, as we've seen with other buyouts as they've occurred, you know, decisions get made at a social level, and you know, and we'll again implement government policy in relation to that. Yeah.
One over here first, and then. Thanks. My question is to Graham.
and I'm not going to make a question about commercial netting. We had a meeting with the Catchment Management Authority last week, and I suppose out of that meeting came a concern about water flows into the Gippsland Lakes. Now, we understand that there's going to be a considerable push over the next 20 or 30 years, given the increasing populations in Melbourne and also the increasing population that's going to occur in Gippsland. As we believe, and we may be wrong, that the environmental flows into the Gippsland Lakes are becoming less and less because of water demands from various uses, industrial and agricultural. How do you see the water management for the freshwater flows into the Gippsland Lakes progressing over the next 20 or 30 years?
Yeah, it's a good question, and thanks for asking it, because, I mean, the Gippsland Lakes, the catchment, in other words, where the water comes out of, is about 2 million hectares, or about 10% of the state of Victoria in terms of total scale. So it's got a series of very large-scale dams, Thompson Dam being one that people talk about a lot, but there's a lot of other dams that are on the total catchment of the Gippsland Lakes that are used for things like power generation and used for things like water supply for towns and then agricultural water. So no one's making any new water. So a lot of the allocations for that water are quite historic. They've been developed over the years. But what we're noticing, and I'm not a climate change sort of, I'm not trying to shove that down anyone's sort of throat or anything, but if we get periods of long dry, there's still that allocation of water that goes to the industry and the power stations and agriculture. So those rights to water are still there, but the flows are a bit less. So the long-term impacts for the Gippsland Lakes could be that there's a greater reliance on us using environmental flows to keep the freshwater wetlands going. Or we might have to look at innovative ways around the wetlands on the Gippsland Lakes to apply water like an irrigator does. So an example could be Hart's Morass, which is not in my catchment area, it's in the West Gippy, but it's on the Latrobe system. We're looking at options for how we might actually water the morass. So like an irrigator might water their paddock, we might also, instead of using a flood-based method to get fresh water on those wetlands, we might look at pumps and regulators so that we can actually manage the freshwater needs of those wetlands. So I'm not sure I'm answering your total question, but I'm just trying to give you an indication that I don't think there's more water getting used. I just think it's difficult to in a climate change environment with these variable times, it's more difficult to manage the water.
Follow up a bit.
Yeah.
There's a desalination plant sitting down there on the bank. It's spent a lot of time there idle. It costs a lot of money to keep sitting idle.
Yeah.
So if climate change is a reality, and I am a climate change believer, and I think that there's considerable less fresh water flow actually going into the Gippsland Lakes as a consequence of that. Is that desalination plant going to be brought into effect to help provide environmental water?
Yeah, you're talking above my head there. It's a good question. So I really couldn't answer that one. I mean, my role is in dealing with the sort of environmental factors that are coming at us, and a question like whether you would apply desal for environmental purposes, that one's a bit over my head. It doesn't.
I'm thinking about desal for Melbourne water rather than the water coming out of the Gippsland Lake system for Melbourne.
Yeah, again, I mean, that's good ideas creation, but I'm not the answer for that one.
Simon and Paul presented to us about the declining catch rates, and there was a question earlier about whether there'd be the
Yeah, I'll take that one. I think it's, again, a really good question. And I think what you've seen through Kate's presentation is that we'll continually remain open to reforming how we regulate, because we completely understand that sometimes we mightn't always get it right, but also our population changes, the way people fish changes, and we need to always be on top of that. So, things like having closed seasons for spawning population, I thought Paul gave a really good response on that about, is that the key priority or is it about habitat? Look, we'll keep an open mind on all of that and continue to do the work and monitor what happens with the fishery. If we have, climatic conditions or other things contribute, like we have, 10,000 people a day fishing Lake Tyers and we're seeing a lot of pressure coming in, then we need to continue to adapt to that. So, at the moment we're open-minded to it. It's not panic stations with any of those fisheries. They seem to still be performing, maybe not as good as they were 4 or 5 years ago. Let's have a look at where they are in the next couple of years and then come at some of those options if needed. Or we might have a really big recruitment and a really great breeding year, and all of a sudden we find the fisheries really taking off again, and we're not actually sure that we need to make changes at that time.
I'm by no means a scientist, that's for sure. We've got all that covered here with other people, but this gets thrown up a lot with bream and with other species. Let's have a closed season. It's a knee-jerk reaction to think, let's let something spawn, it's going to be great. But from a social perspective, it's an absolute nightmare. I wouldn't go near it with a barge pole if I was anything to do with fisheries, I can tell you. Let's just imagine I'm a farmer from Hay, I'm going to go down to have a flatty fish. I've turned up in town, I've booked my flat, I've done everything, and you go, it's out of season for Dusky flathead. It's going to be just an absolute nightmare. And there's so many other species in an area that you might want to fish for that's going to be impacted by it. If you really go through it and, get the nuts and bolts of a closed season, trust me, it's a nightmare. And some of the other parts of the world that done things like that and then pulled that out and decided it was a nightmare. I just reckon there's so many other options to go through and look at before you'd ever look at something like that. Even for bream, I mean, it's getting off the subject maybe a tad, but people want to have a closed season for somewhere for bream in top of Malakuta and stuff. It's been suggested. Okay, so you don't have anglers up there, so all of a sudden it's open slather for someone who wants to sneak in with a net, no reporting, no people in the area. A nightmare for that particular aspect of it. And the other thing is, bream cereal spawners spawn every day for months and months and months, so you're going to cut a lifeline off of all the tourism for something like that. I think you just, I'll be very sceptical of anyone barking up that tree anyway. My tip also. Yeah, well, that's debatable. I mean, you're talking to the wrong man here. We won't get into that probably, but I think there's a lot of other ways to manage things except saying no. It's pretty easy in the world to go, no, you can't fish. No, you can't do this. No, you can't do that. I think the guys are already doing a great job with working out what works and how can we do stuff and keep the social aspects of fishing going. So I think it's dangerous as all. That's the only reason I'm jumping in. I always have the big alarm bell goes off when someone says, let's just have a closed season. That's all. You got to think about it really before you take a radical step like that. Anyway, I'll get off that bandwagon.
Questions? Yeah, I've got a question. Look, my name's Jake Costello. I live in Lake Tyers. I have for the last probably 6 years in that area, maybe a little bit more. And I've become a Dusky flathead fisherman in that time, and that's basically all I target. Some of the problems that I've seen with release of fish, with the slot bin and so forth, and I've devised a way which I think helps a lot. I'm carrying a black fish box without holes in it. I net a fish, it gets dropped into that fish box with water in it, and for some reason I've noticed that the fish in the black fish box settle. I don't know why, but they seem to. I then measure the fish in there, and when I go to release the fish, I pick the fish box up with water in it, go straight into the water. You don't seem to lose a lot of scale much signage for the average punter that comes down to say the slot limit exists. And it's pretty hard to sort of talk to someone down, as you say, a farmer that comes from Timbuktu or wherever, it's got maybe more than 5 fish, or maybe fish that are bigger than 55. And I try and avoid it because I think, you know, they sort of think that you own the place or whatever. So a sign there, I think, would be a good thing. And maybe a little bit of talk about catch and release, because you do see a lot of fish coming onto the bank or jetty, and the foot still goes on the head, and, you know, oversized fish, and try and counter suppose, and these people, they don't know.
So your real question, I think there is signage there. It's whether it's prominent enough is another. No signage there.
No, I think we had some temporary signage that went in. Sorry, Bob, did you want to say something, mate?
I'd like to think that I catch quite a few at times. And judging on the size of them, I cut them off at the side of the boat. I feel that even bringing them in the boat and handling them, I can offset that. I'm only recording them, I'm going to send them away, and I have a pretty fair idea whether it's 70, 80 or 80 plus. And so now I try and get them in as quietly as I can alongside the boat and just cut them off, send them off, and I put them in my book at 70 or 70 plus. And other thing I'd like to make a comment on, Simon, about the number of big fish being caught in Lake Tyers. I have a feeling that because the fishing there is so poor, that because I'm a bait fisherman, that the bigger fish are getting more bait thrown at them than they normally are. Because if I'm getting fish that are up to 40, and then there's a cut-off point between 40 and 50, I don't seem to be catching that area of fish. And the live mullet are then left for the bigger fish each time. And so I think there is a bit of a worry with that statistic that shows there. Not only the fact that they're being caught more often by people other than myself. Can these fish sustain being brought into the boat, handled, put back several times? And that's what I think's happening now. I'm getting, on an average, I'd say 60% of the time I go out, I'm getting one or more returnable fish.
A few questions there and a couple, but I think everyone would say that the great handling practices by putting them in a bin, and I think however you do that, you know, I think everyone would encourage more of that.
Yeah, Bob. Bob. A couple of things there. Handling practice, definitely. You've got great handling practices, and we've heard today that, you know, we need to encourage that, and the leaders here can do that. Survival, you know, from the evidence we have, Kate brought it up, the survival is good if handled correctly. The other spot, you mentioned the largest size class within the slot limit that you're thinking of drop off. Now, again, we'll monitor that over the next couple of years. We should see that lower group of fish move up, or we're looking at a gap in the year class, but that's understandable as well. Or we have to really monitor that fishing pressure in the top end of the slot limit as well. So lot more monitoring.
I just wouldn't mind picking up on the handling of the fish stuff. Like Joe's right, he fishes a lot, and I've been seeing how he handles those fish, and I do think there is a broader topic of discussion around what's the best method, how can we promote that, and I have noticed the Murray cod, the Fisheries is looking, or have released some information about how to handle Murray cod and the best practice, Trav.
Yeah, careful cod.
care for cod, and I think that's a fantastic initiative that starts to say, hey, these things are precious, how do we look after them? So, there'd be merit, Joe, I reckon, in, us looking at how can we do that with Duskies if, to keep them, yeah.
Just on touching on what Bob was talking about, from what I see, the big numbers of people now are really fishing for float, and cutting the fish off at the side of the boat doesn't sort of suit the lures and go with it. And the other thing is you do catch a few fish that have got a trail and a hook. I'm not saying it's probably a good way to go with this. I know hooks dissolve, but doing it that way with a lure fishery is probably not going to happen. Bringing them in, they're swimming away really well out of the box. I'm not touching them too much. They seem to be good.
So, Joe, I mean, you've made a couple of good points. We did have signage up at a lot of the fish cleaning tables when we originally brought in the slot size. Some of that might be gone. Your observations are suggesting that we still need to maintain that, because it has been a number of years now since the slot came in. But that's good feedback to us, and that's certainly something that we can pick up.
Basically, one of the things that I see when I'm walking the dog and going fishing is there's signage that's absolutely huge for wearing life jackets.
Yeah. Yeah.
And the signage for the floated is
Smaller. Yeah. And on your second point, and so in terms of slot sizes, so it's a pretty new evolution in Victoria with its Murray cod. We've got a slot size now. With Dusky Flathead, we've got a slot size. So when you think about that, we're actually encouraging people to go and target big fish, to catch them and to release them, and to the ones they want to have to eat are within that slot. And we think we've had a really strong support from fishers all across Victoria on that. But following on from that, if we're going to have a lot more people catching a lot bigger fish, which is great, they get great photos and great memories, then that effort and that work about making sure that the mortality of those big fish remains really low is something that we'll continue to put a lot of effort in, because we weren't where we were 5 years ago in terms of slot sizes. So that's changing now. And even though Bushy and Rex started off on the releasing fish, we've got a lot of people to not throw the big ones in the esky, to actually let them go, and we'll work on making sure they let them go as best as they can to give them a chance.
Probably, yep.
Can I just make a remark on what I believe is the environmental health in Gippsland Lakes here? I've lived in Lakes Edward all my life. I've been a commercial fisherman, always angled right from JB. The lower reaches of the lakes here, I don't fish the top reaches at all, but I see the banks, what would normally be growth on the side of the banks, just falling in. The desalination of the Gippsland Lakes here is a really, really big problem. Commercial fishermen, everybody have got, the blame for a lot of things. I believe personally that there's room for both. We can all have a go at it. And when Bushy says closed season worked very, very well for Murray cod and all the rest of it. It's education first, not thinking of our hip pocket where we might sell a lure or something else that you take the fishery away. I believe that all stock should be closed in the peak spawning periods.
Yeah, thanks for your comments. The Gippsland Lakes ones, you're right, it's challenging. Like we would, just call that shoreline erosion, right, what you're talking about. And there's a lot of theories about the cause. So in some instances, people say it's salt, related. And then there's other theories around that the actual sea is rising. So when the sea comes up, even if it's a tiny amount, it actually tries to expand into the land. So what we might be seeing, and don't treat this as a fact, because a lot of this stuff we're still working our way through, is just the slow impacts of the sea coming up. And so what I'm trying to say is I think your observations are right. We're seeing a fair bit of shoreline erosion, but the exact cause, that's where all the variability comes in. We're not quite sure. on the Gippy Lakes too, there's quite a large program of works which is funded by the Victorian government. So there's about 12.5 million being spent at the moment on works around the Gippsland Lakes to try and help keep the lakes in as good a nick as we can. Now, look, I'm not saying this is perfect, but there's a significant effort from a lot of community groups, a lot of agencies all working really closely together to try and keep the lakes in good shape. And again, I'm not saying it's perfect, but there's an enormous amount of effort going in by a lot of people. And shoreline erosion is one of those concerns. You're quite right what you're saying, I think. And so there's revegetation programs on shorelines. There's a bit of structural work on places like the silt jetties, the Mitchell silt jetties. So yeah, there's certainly your observations are shared by others, but there's nothing happening about it. There's quite a significant amount of work. But thanks for your question, and I think that's the sort of thing that these forums are great for, people's observations, and tell us what they're seeing. And so thanks for contributing.
Last question, sorry.
On a different note, just interested to know if anybody knows, like in a closed system like Lake Tyers, whether the spawning of the fish in that closed system is any different to a tidal estuary.
Yeah, that's a great question, and a question I've been thinking a lot about in relation to Duskies. I'm pretty confident that they'll spawn and their young will survive quite well in a closed system, and you can do it in the hatchery, so it's not too different to the closed lake. And if the conditions are right, the entrance closure, if the conditions are right and you get good survival, that may be a key to getting a really good year class into the fishery, because you're not losing any spawn out on the tide. But yeah, obviously in New South Wales, great dusky fisheries and a lot of open estuaries there. So, you know, in relation to whether there's success or whatever varies, the other uncertainty is what does the tidal flow into the estuary do in terms of bringing, you know, different types of salinity or nutrients or things into the system to mix to create conditions for those tiny plankton, because some of those plankton are very sensitive to salinity, and you get certain species growing from the ocean that come in and prosper if the salinity is higher or lower. So it's a very uncertain area, and in terms of Duskies and what drives those population cycles, I think that's a really important one to consider, particularly for Tyers.
Thank you very much. It's now lunchtime. I think lunch is set up, ready to go. I'd like you to all thank our panel. I know there's a number of other questions we could have got to. Corner the guest speakers over lunch if you really want that to answer that question. I'd like you to thank our presenters and